So welcome everyone to this IUCN WCPA Vital Sites event, Privately Protected Areas on the Move, part 2 of a 3-part webinar series. We welcome all of our viewers from around the world and are just waiting for everyone to tune in.
Thanks, Rashir. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this second of 3 Vital Sites webinars on privately protected areas. PPAs are underrepresented in national protected area systems and underreported internationally, despite the fact that they are a rapidly growing manifestation of diverse conservation areas. And fulfilling the ambitious targets we expect to be set later this year on area-based conservation will certainly include private conservation. This webinar series is based on guidelines for privately protected areas, part of IUCN's series of guidelines of best practices in protected areas. The document of guidelines for PPAs is freely available on iucn.org in English, French, Spanish, Japanese, and soon in Portuguese as well. These guidelines were developed by the Specialist Group on Privately Protected Areas and Nature's Stewardship of IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas. The group is working to elevate the recognition, understanding, and integrity of private conservation worldwide. The guidelines draw from wide experience. We had over 100 contributors and commenters on the draft. The work is coordinated by QLF, Atlantic Center for the Environment, under the auspices of IUCN. Our partner in this work is the International Academy for Nature Conservation of BFN, the German Nature Conservation Agency. BFN will host a training website soon, which will include a lot of additional information, so watch for that. Now we will have Gisela Stolp, the head of BFN's International Academy for Nature Conservation, give a few words of welcome. Gisela?
Yes, hi everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation to this second seminar in the training series, Privately Protected Areas on the Move. And as Brent already pointed out, this session is part of a joint project by the World Commission on Protected Areas Specialist Group on PPAs in collaboration with the International Academy for Nature Conservation. Our agency has a great interest in supporting this training series because we are convinced that protected areas are one of the most effective instruments to conserve nature. Limited government funding, however, is one of the reasons that make it difficult for countries to reach the agreed global biodiversity targets. Privately protected areas have the potential to tap on financial resources beyond the government and to reach out to motivated non-governmental stakeholders who intend to effectively manage PPAs in perpetuity. Our International Academy and IUCN have a long-standing collaboration, also within the frame of a partnership agreement. And numerous workshops and expert meetings have been organized on the Isle of Film that address the implementation of the CBD and its program of work on protected areas. Together with the Specialist Group on Protected Areas and Nature Stewardship, we convened a number of expert workshops on the Isle of Film that helped to draft the best practice guidelines on PPAs that were already mentioned by Brent and that are now translated in so many languages. With the Academy's focus on capacity development, it is well placed to support the development of trainings and tools to encourage the application of the best practice guidelines. And so, based on these BPGs, a training series was jointly developed, of which today's session is a part. And as Brent also already mentioned, complementary training materials also for self-paced learning will be available online on our website later this year. 2 weeks ago, many of you already met to discuss definitions of PPAs, their objectives, and aspects around the establishment and management of PPAs. Today's seminar will shed light on the most critical aspect of permanence. It will provide you with an overview of different subtypes of PPAs and the need to coordinate with national PA systems. With regard to PPA subtypes, we see in Europe an increasing interest of NGOs and foundations in privately protected areas, but also a great potential for other actors, for example, churches and religious communities, to play a greater role in conserving and protecting nature on their own property, as the church is still a big landowner in Europe. I wish you now an inspiring seminar with fruitful discussions on critical aspects of privately protected areas. Thank you very much for joining this seminar series.
Thank you, Gisela. We will now get into the core of our session. We'll hear from 3 presenters covering 3 sections of the guidelines, each for up to 15 minutes. For a number of reasons, all presentations have been pre-recorded. During their talks, please use the chat function to ask any questions you may have. After the 3 presentations, I will pose any clarifying questions you submit to the appropriate speaker. To add different perspectives and experience, we will then invite 3 respondents to speak to each of the 3 presentations for up to 5 minutes each. We'll then have a panel discussion, and I will pose more substantive questions or share comments you submit in the chat. Experience shows that the 90 minutes will go quickly. First, we have from Juan Bazari-Creel talking about permanence of privately protected areas. Juan leads the Biodiversity Foundation and worked for a long time with the Nature Conservancy in Mexico.
Good day, I'm Juan Besori, a Mexican member of the Privately Protected Areas and Nature Stewardship group of the World Commission on Protected Areas. Here today, I'm going to talk about ensuring PPA's permanence, which is covered in the 4th section of IUCN's guidelines on privately protected areas. In 1974, my parents bought this fantastic 25-acre piece of misty conifer forested land with a stream, a waterfall, and several ponds near Mexico City, part of which you can see in the background, to be used as a weekend country place. I was the principal caretaker of the land until I moved to Cancun to work on the Siancan Biosphere Reserve. But other members of the family kept looking after the place, with our parents providing the funding to care for the land until their deaths. Fast forward 47 years to 2021. 9 siblings, 6 wives or husbands, 13 grandchildren, and as of now, 5 great-grandchildren later, the permanence of the place as a PPA is jeopardized. Simply put, an appropriate legal mechanism and governance mechanism to guarantee its permanence was not established. And while the place is still being looked after, nobody knows for how long it will remain within the family, since most probably it will be sold. With this, all the beauty and memories of family and friends who love the place will go. There's long-term intent is the key to permanence. Long-term intent was proposed as an alternative to long-term conservation for government protected areas. PPAs should demonstrate an intent to conservation in perpetuity or at least long-term. With PPAs, it's understood that it can take time to put in place arrangements such as covenants, tenure agreements, etc., which ensure permanent protection. PPAs thus should demonstrate conservation in perpetuity or at least the intent for conservation in the long term. The latter being defined in this case for a minimum of 25 years. Of the 34 principles included in the guidelines for privately protected areas, 2 of them deal directly with ensuring their permanence. Principle 4.1, PPA governance should embody the long-term intent to achieve conservation and its approach through 7 best practices. And principle 4.2 indicates that many different private conservation instruments can contribute to PPA permanence, which include 2 best practices. Principle 4.1, PPA governance should embody the long-term intent to achieve conservation. This should demonstrate that the PPA status will transcend changes of ownership through easements, covenants, wills, transfer of development rights, and other appropriate legal means. When formal agreements relating to PPAs are short-term, demonstrating a commitment to long-term protection, e.g. renewable agreements or long-term stated objectives, can be used to demonstrate long-term intent. Active or passive management practices being applied in order to safeguard the integrity of natural resources present in the PPA that are validated by government or local and regional units of national associations of PPAs with guidelines and national diversity. Areas, for instance, areas owned by the National Trust of the UK are some of the most secure protected places in the United Kingdom. Best practice 4.1. Permanence is best secured through legal instruments empowerment governments. Long-term conservation PPAs is often most effectively achieved with a legal conservation instrument linked through an institutionalized conservation agent or legal status through an appropriate government agent, such as the case of Brazil, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand, and others. Provisions within land trusts, incorporation charters that include appropriate conservation land disposition practices to same-minded institutions, guaranteeing the persistence of conservation objectives in case of foreseeable land trust institutional failure, are also considered as the appropriate legal conservation instrument. So, permanence. Practice 4.1.2. Where legal instruments are not possible, agreements should be renewable and the conservation intent should be in perpetuity. Short-term governmental financial incentives, such as payment for ecosystem services, could be a point of entry to short-term private lands conservation practices. But the ending of an agreement does not necessarily mean the ending of PPA status if they intend to find an alternative mechanism for long-term conservation. One of these examples is the Payment for Ecosystem Service program in Mexico. Here is the sign of a property in Sierra de las Navajas in Hidalgo, which receives such payments. Best practice 4.1.3. Where legal instrument or status is not available or feasible, some transparent proof of long-term intent should be developed. Proof of this long-term conservation intent in writing available to interested parties together with a description of how the intention will be implemented over time. Long-term management plans can also provide this type of proof, and changes should be transparent. Transparency does not have to mean that information is available to everyone, but this information should be provided to a recognized land conservation institution, an established PPA network, or an appropriate government agency. Best practice 4.1.2. Individual conservation intent should be secured for future ownerships. This is critical. A clear succession plan for the continuation of the PPA status should be required, including land use restrictions, financial, and transfer of ownership. Problems could arise if no legal instruments are in place for achieving long-term protection of the land, water, and no planning for the financial resources required for management, e.g. trust fund. An alternative is to make legal provisions to transfer governance and/or ownership to a conservation management institution, a like-minded NGO, a formal land trust, or other such entities. Best practice 415. Being part of a private conservation network can help ensure long-term conservation. Permanence of protection can be more likely when landholders organize themselves formally with intent to privately preserve and manage lands over the long term. Here we see the Valero property, a large private hunting reserve in Spain within a national park. The private owners in this case have a land stewardship agreement with the foundation Naturaleza y Hombre, Nature and Man. Best practice 416. PPAs should have mechanisms in place to ensure that the intent for conservation does not change with leadership. PPA owners with short-term planning cycles or where leadership and landholding can change rapidly, for instance, companies, can potentially affect the continuity necessarily for long-term conservation. Ensuring conservation focus can be facilitated through policy approved by the oversight body, as well as reserving seats for representatives with a conservation focus on decision-making boards. The picture shows the Nature Conservancy's reintroduced herd of bison into a Luna Ranch in Janos Biosphere Reserve, Chihuahua. The property was held by TNC for a few years and further transferred to the Mexican Fund for Conservation of Nature, but TNC keeps retainers to guarantee its long-term protection. Best practice 417, government programs enabling and encouraging private conservation should include provisions for permanence through official government recognition provided at a national or subnational level, through economic or tax incentives offered, or through their integration into government conservation strategies and thus into wider biodiversity protection systems. Principle 2, many different private conservation instruments can contribute to PPA permanence. The number of PPAs is growing globally, and the number of people involved in a range of practices also. As the diversity of types of PPA develops, there is an increasing range of approaches which can contribute to ensuring permanence of conservation outcomes. The best practice 421 says conservation restrictions limiting some uses while allowing others can be effective conservation too, and can sometimes meet the definition of PPA. The glossary within the PPA guidelines explain the scope for some available conservation tools, not all of them, but these: the appurtenant easement or easement appendant, a conservation easement, the covenant, easement in gross, fee simple ownership, transfer of development rights, and usufruct. In Chile, for example, recently in 2016, pioneered a new legal instrument for private land protection called Derecho Real de Conservación. Previously, the legal system required that a conservation agreement, a servidumbre in Spanish, can only be made between two adjacent properties. Now it can be made between properties that are not adjacent. This is the situation for civil law systems, the Roman Code, versus the common law which is the British system, which was also adopted by its colonies, where you don't need this adjacent situation. So Chile did something that many of us should copy from now on. Best practice 422, processes should be put in place to deal with potential violations of conservation restrictions. There should be a mitigation and action plan prepared to whenever compliance issues arise. The plan should indicate when the enforcement organization should negotiate breaches or obligations on where or when it should take legal recourse. Here, it's important to indicate that availability of financial resources to be used to pay for legal fees should be part of the above-mentioned action plan. Thank you very much for your attention. Hope we all learned something from this presentation.
Juan, thank you for that excellent presentation. I'm not sure why we had the technical difficulty of the black boxes appearing, but I can assure you we were neither redacting nor censoring any of Juan's presentation, and I hope we won't have that distraction in the next one.
It will also be fixed in the YouTube version, so it won't show up there.
Okay, thanks. So we will continue with the second presentation. We'll hear from Nigel Dudley, a member of the WCPA specialist group on PPAs and a highly experienced protected area consultant from Equilibrium Research in the UK. And Nigel will be talking about the various subtypes of PPA.
Hello, my name is Nigel Dudley. I'm a member of the specialist group on privately protected areas and nature stewardship of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, and I'm one of the contributors to the best practice guidelines being described in these webinars. I've been working on protected area governance and management issues for the last 25 years as part of Equilibrium Research, which is a small consultancy and think tank. This presentation is going to take a look at some of the more unusual types of privately protected areas. Most protected areas, most PPAs are run either by private individuals or by non-profit organizations and trusts. In other words, they're run with the sole aim of conserving nature or perhaps protecting an area of land or water of particular value to a person or a family. But not all PPAs fall into this category. Over the next few minutes, I'll be describing some of the other models and showing how they fit into a broader approach to conservation at the landscape and seascape scale. Privately protected areas can also be run by organizations not usually associated in people's minds with conservation. For example, mining or oil companies, tourism operators, this is one of the commonest PPA subgroups, forestry and farming operations, religious bodies and institutions, and finally, areas are sometimes protected for research purposes. So, for example, outside Mombasa in Kenya, the French quarrying company Lafarge runs a privately protected area in part of its lands. Baobab trees, which are considered sacred, have been carefully preserved, and forests have been restored in areas, and forests have been restored in places where operations are complete. There are ponds, tree nurseries, and some captive animals. It's far from wilderness, but it plays an important role in educating youngsters in the region, most of whom don't have the opportunity to visit national parks or otherwise to come across iconic landscape in their region. I had a glimpse of a green mamba when I visited. It's a shy and elusive species of snake confined to the coastal regions of southern and eastern Africa. This is an important area for conservation. Private for-profit ecotourism companies sometimes run their own nature reserves, like this one in Namibia. Guests usually have exclusive visiting rights, and depending on whether or not there are dangerous animals around, can either wander around on their own or take a tour with a guide. Most people who set up ecotourism ventures are themselves interested in conservation. And of course, they also have a commercial incentive in preserving species and keeping the ecosystem in good condition. But there can also be tensions. For example, there might be a temptation to bring in too many tourists, so many tourists that animals become disturbed. Some commercial PPAs are fenced, which makes it easier to control the wildlife, and for example means that people can come have close access to species that would not be possible if there were large predators present, but also obviously blocks connectivity. Increasingly, the best ecotourism PPA ventures are part of one of the various certification systems available to provide independent verification and good management. Excuse me. Although commercial forestry usually falls outside the remit of protected areas, many companies that own large forest areas have places set aside for nature conservation. This may just be because they're commercially uneconomic to exploit, but can also be due to the interests of the forest manager, for example, because the area has particular nature values and old trees. Maybe it's a nesting site for rare birds. Under some voluntary certification schemes, like the Forest Stewardship Council, certified companies are obliged to set aside a certain percentage of their holdings as reserves, usually identified using tools like high conservation value assessment. And if these are set aside permanently, they may also be qualified as PPAs, privately protected areas. Religious institutions such as temples, monasteries, and churches are increasingly setting aside some of their lands and waters as PPAs. For example, Rila Monastery in Bulgaria, in the main picture here, is inside Rila National Park, and the monks coordinate with national park authorities. Similar situations exist in national parks elsewhere, for example, in Spain, in Japan and Korea, with concerns for the natural world being reflected in all the world's great religions. Even small areas can be important. The grounds of churches in Ethiopia are in some areas the only remnants of the original forest vegetation. Although tiny, they are the refuges that are stopping a whole ecosystem from disappearing. Care for nature in this way is today often seen as a positive demonstration of faith. And finally, in our list of different motivations for private conservation, universities and environmental research bodies frequently have areas set aside for research purposes, where students and academics have easy access and the freedom to carry out experiments unhindered by anyone else. Many of these sites are quite small, but they can be amongst the most strictly protected areas in the world. Photograph shows a research reserve in Lithuania, in Europe, one of a network stretching across Europe, providing the means not only to learn more about the ecology of natural ecosystems, but also as a baseline to chart the changes that are taking place due to climate change, other forms of pollution, or the spread of invasive species. So on to the best practices. The first of the associated best practices refers to recognition. Principle 5.1 reads, specific types of PPAs may require tailored forms of recognition, support, and encouragement. Recognizing that each comes with unique aims and values. Best practice 5.1.1 states, encourage companies and other institutions owning or managing PPAs to list them on the World Database on Protected Areas. This is important because it confers public recognition and thus additional security to the area. And best practice 5.1.2 states, investigative partnerships with NGOs, academics, or other specialists to maximize the value of the PPA. Many of the broader constituency of PPA owners we've just talked about will not have the specialized knowledge to practice conservation management. So input from other experts, either hired as consultants or often volunteers, can help fill this gap. Principle 5.2 addresses the particular issue of PPAs owned by commercial companies outside the ecotourism sector and notes that Corporate PPAs offer specific benefits to companies and vice versa. This might, for example, be a personal interest to the company director or a member of the board. Many decisions like this are very personal, but it also might enhance a company's green credentials to have a reserve, to make use of land owned but no longer used by the company, or areas unsuitable for exploitation, but particularly valuable for conservation, or maybe areas that are undergoing restoration. And although the companies probably won't have conservation expertise unless they are large enough to hire professionals, they do bring other important skills to the table. For example, best practice 5.2.1 recognizes this. Companies and other subtypes of PPAs can deploy strengths such as management skills, capital, financial resilience, and capacity for conservation management. So in these cases, companies aren't just partners, they're also a group that brings something to the table. Principle 5.3 looks at the particular strengths and potential dangers of some company reserves. PPAs managed by extractive industries must demonstrate contributions to biodiversity conservation, with the accompanying best practice 5.3.1. A PPA managed as part of an extractive operation should be separate from that operation. This might be an area set aside deliberately, or in some cases an abandoned quarry, but it needs to be distinct from current operations. So in the Mombasa operation mentioned earlier, there's a working quarry and then a completely separate nature reserve. As noted, PPAs linked to ecotourism can sometimes be split between commercial and conservation priorities. Principle 5.4 shows where the balance should lie. PPAs set up as for-profit companies or enterprises should ensure they achieve their specified conservation outcomes. Two best practices build on this. Best practice 5.4.1 states that PPAs built as for-profit ventures should develop resilient financial models to ensure sustainable conservation outcomes. The COVID pandemic has highlighted this risk. PPAs linked with ecotourism are always going to be vulnerable to sudden changes due to environmental or political factors and need contingency plans. And therefore, best practice 5.4.2 notes any inherent tensions between profit and conservation should be addressed through well-articulated objectives. Emphasizing the initial planning of a PPA and identifying its core conservation objectives can help when making hard decisions about commercial decisions or conservation. Principle 5.5 looks at religious entities and notes that religious entities can contribute to conservation through developing PPAs on their own land. But many religious bodies may not immediately see conservations within their sphere of influence or their interests and can benefit from help and encouragement. So best practice 5.5.1 notes, encourage faith groups to integrate their wider faith objectives with place-based conservation. And the next best practice goes further with advice to support faith groups through active participation, partnership, and advice. In Bhutan, a meeting of faith leaders and conservationists reached remarkably similar conclusions about conservation and what should be done, even though coming from very different starting points. These wider range of conservation types in PPAs have often been ignored or undervalued, yet they bring non-traditional actors into conservation, which has implications way beyond the lands and waters within the PPA. As conservation moves from niche to mainstream, these more subtle benefits will become ever more important. Thank you. For more information, please see the accompanying website.
All right. Thank you for that from Nigel. Did have a number of clarifying questions, which I will pose after we get through the third presentation. We also have some more substantive questions and comments, which we'll bring up after the respondents. But now we'll have our third and final main presentation. we have, let's see, sorry. That's from James Fitzsimons, Director of Conservation and Science at the Nature Conservancy in Australia.
Well, hello everybody. My name is James Fitzsimons. I'm the Director of Conservation and Science for the Nature Conservancy's Australia program. I'm an adjunct professor at Deakin University here in Australia and a member of the Privately Protected Area and Nature Stewardship Specialist Group for the IUCN, involved in putting these best practice guidelines together. I'm also the owner of my own privately protected area here in Australia, and there's an image of that woodland behind me now. I'm going to be talking today about the coordination of PPAs within national protected area systems. And this is a really important topic as governments and the conservation sector are increasingly interested in incorporating PPAs into national systems of protected areas, both to meet international conservation targets and for more comprehensive landscape scale conservation planning. It's fair to say for many countries, the concept of incorporating non-state protected area governance types into national protected area systems is still relatively new. In some cases, PPAs will have been established independently from national system of protected areas. In other cases, they may be actively encouraged by governments and NGOs to fill important gaps in conservation coverage. This presentation today is largely drawn from Section 6 of the IUCN PPA guidelines, and I'll talk through each of the principles and best practices. So coordination as part of national protected area systems can create a range of conservation benefits. These benefits could be in the form of better prioritisation for protected area network expansion, better understanding of protected corridors, and more coordinated management across the landscape. Specifically, this could include acting as a buffer to larger public protected areas where they adjoin, such as this relatively small property owned by the Rainforest Rescue and adjoining the Daintree National Park in North Queensland, Australia. But also more substantial PPAs, those coloured in blue on this map, adjoining Kruger National Park, coloured in grey in the northwest of South Africa. PPAs can also provide important connecting roles between public, private or Indigenous protected areas or other conservation lands, such as here in Gondwan Link, a connectivity network in southwest Western Australia. In Belize's northeastern biological corridor, which includes PPAs, it's allowing for the expansion of the country's successful reintroduction program for the endangered Yucatan black howler monkey, and soon also for the endangered Jeffroy's spider monkey. And PPAs can also play an important role in increasing the representation of ecosystems, such as this Trust for Nature Reserve, protecting endangered and underrepresented native grasslands in southern Australia. The first best practice under this principle is very important, and that is that inclusion of PPAs in national systems should only occur with landholders' consent. This follows the IUCN's resolution at the World Conservation Congress in 2016, where PPAs were encouraged to be reported in national and global databases, as long as it was in collaboration and agreement with the owners of such areas. And further research and reasonings for this are outlined in a paper I wrote with colleagues a couple of years ago, if that's of interest. The second practice for this principle notes that where existing PPAs are included in or affiliated with national systems after their establishment, it's important that this does not inadvertently impose additional legal or management obligations upon landowners beyond the conditions of their existing PPA. As we've already heard and seen, PPAs make important contributions to national systems in a variety of ways. However, national systems should recognise both PPAs that have high prioritised natural values, but also those considered potentially less valuable to national priorities as well. Recognition of PPAs by governments is an important first step for incorporation of PPAs into national systems. Now, this recognition can be at various levels, including individual PPAs, groups of PPAs under the same organisation, such as local, national or regional NGOs, research, business or faith groups, or a particular PPA mechanism, such as a covenant or an easement by a protected area authority. Ideally, the definition of what constitutes a PPA at the relevant jurisdictional level is made explicit in public policy documents or guidelines to ensure the transparency And also it should align with the IUCN's definition of a PPA. An example given here in Australia is that Australia's national strategy for the national reserve system in this country and other policy documents clearly recognises the importance of different particular governance types in contributing to our sort of shared goals here in this country for a comprehensive, adequate and representative reserve system across the country. Recognition also has a spatial element. Now, formally recognised PPAs can be incorporated into system maps with the consent of the landowner and thus contribute to national, state and regional conservation planning. On this map, you can see in blue, for example, some but not all PPAs are included as other governance types in Australia. Likewise in Peru, part of the national strategy, their national maps clearly document all types of PPAs along with national and subnational protected areas. Recognition and support of PPAs can occur at different scales and at different jurisdictional levels from national to regional to local. For example, in Australia, while national recognition may be important for the national inventory, it's actually the state-based legislation that may be required to legally protect the site. And indeed, its local authorities may be the ones providing financial incentives. Likewise, in Argentina, there's no protected area law at a national level, and this is actually undertaken at a subnational level. And of the 23 provinces in Argentina, 12 include PPAs in their protected area laws. Strategies for incorporation of PPAs into national protected area systems can be driven by government, as is the case of Australia and South Africa, or the private or NGO sector, for example, in Costa Rica, or a hybrid approach with initiatives from both sides, such as in the UK. Regardless of the approach, ensuring mutual trust and transparency, articulated dual benefits is likely to result in much greater success in the long term. Brazil, Colombia, Peru are among the few countries in Latin America to include PPAs in their official systems of protected areas. In Colombia, in some cases, the coordination of PPAs within the national system of protected areas is being done through the network of natural reserves of civil society. Several of these NGOs are locally based and are also the main resource managers for the implementation and management plans for private reserves. As I've outlined earlier, the benefits for integrating with national protected area systems include improved ability to meet global conservation targets and their on-ground implementation at the national and regional scales, such as representation, connectivity, ecosystem services, etc. But also the more efficient placement of future protected areas of various governance types which benefit existing landowners by increasing the visibility of their conservation assets, the potential for coordinated management of threats or ecological processes occurring across public and private land, coordination of endangered species conservation, and also increasing the constituency for protected areas and national systems through incorporating committed landowners. Ultimately, a better understanding of the location, values and directions of the respective protected area governance types leads to more informed conservation planning. Inclusion of a PPA in a national system can range from formal recognition of its contribution to biodiversity conservation to improved financial incentives for undertaking protection and management. However, it is important to recognise that not all owners of PPAs may wish for their land to be incorporated into national systems. This reluctance may stem from the concern that governments could report on PPAs rather than investing in new government protected areas, which is seen by some as a way for governments to meet their international obligations while avoiding difficult or financial decisions. So it is essential for coordinators of national networks to communicate to PPA owners whether their properties will be counted towards targets. Some landowners may also want recognition, but not to have their properties counted towards targets. In cases where PPA landowners do not desire national recognition, alternatives should include a process that recognises a site's legitimacy as a PPA, as well as ways to receive support from other conservation actors to improve conservation outcomes. Another presentation in the series will discuss in more detail the options for reporting to international levels without formal government recognition. Achieving coordinated national systems of protected areas involves more than simply compiling a list. Building communication and discussion to achieve a coordinated system may include annual forums, strategic workshops and communities of practice, meetings to discuss common issues and resolve barriers to better coordination. In some countries, national conferences for private land conservation, such as the US Land Trust Alliance Rally, Australia's Private Land Conservation Conference, Brazil's National Confederation of Private Natural Heritage Reserves, can help identify common issues and strengthen the PPA sector. The International Land Conservation Network Congress is a global forum for strengthening the sector. And IUCN's national committees can also play an important role in developing good links between PPAs and government. In some cases, a more formal approach to coordination has also been successful. In Kenya, a formally constituted board meets several times a year with representatives from all protected area governance types to discuss issues. This includes bringing together all conservancies, giving them a direct input into government policy making, such as developing legislation for conservancies. To improve the effectiveness of landscape scale or jurisdictional level conservation and protected area plans and their implementation, PPA governance authorities should be involved from the early stages of the strategic planning process. Including PPA networks or NGOs on national protected area committees is a logical way to do this. For example, by legislation, the Belize Association for Privately Protected Areas has a seat on the National Protected Area Advisory Council. I'll leave you with this image of Ned's Corner Station. It's a PPA that was purchased by a state-based land trust, the Trust for Nature Victoria, with funding from the Australian Government, the Nature Conservancy and other philanthropic sources, for addition to Australia's National Reserve System. It adjoins existing and new public protected areas on multiple sides and will soon be adjoined by Indigenous protected areas on the other sides. And it's a great example of the value of coordinating PPAs into national protected area systems. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James, for that. We're getting some good questions and comments, most of which I will hold for the panel discussion. But we do have a couple of clarifying questions, and as luck would have it, most of them are directed to the one presenter who couldn't physically be with us today, Nigel, who's otherwise detained. But we will respond as best we can. So from Sybil asks, have you considered marine PPAs such as Chumbe Island Coral Park in Zanzibar, Tanzania? Technically, Chumbe is based on a marine conservation agreement with the government of Zanzibar, concept developed by the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, which documented many examples of private sector and multi-stakeholder participation in marine conservation. And I could respond to that, Sybil, in that when looking at subtypes, we were really looking at subtypes of governance or management. We didn't split out according to ecosystems. So the principles should apply equally to the marine environment as to freshwater PPAs, freshwater environments, mountains, forests, deserts. So yes, in a sense, but we didn't specifically call out marine. Obviously, when you look at the tenure aspects of marine conservation, that much remains to be done to see how these principles can be applied in the marine environment. So that's a good point. Penny, essentially a comment here. I can add another category. Defense land in Australia, a large area of defense land in Western Australia is being managed by an NGO, the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, a private land conservation NGO. So there are many perturbations of some of these concepts. So thanks for that example. And finally, in the clarifying questions area, one from Mikel. Did you mention a sort of network or scientific or research PPAs in Lithuania, or all over Europe? Can you provide some more details? I can't answer that. I don't know if any of our other panelists can. So Miguel, we may have to get back to you on that one. All right, and again, we'll come back to other questions a little bit later on. But now we will hear some additional perspectives on each of these three topics from three respondents. First, we have Michael O'Connell, who will respond on permanence of PPAs. Michael is president and CEO of the Irvine Ranch Conservancy in California and has worked on private land conservation with the Nature Conservancy and WWF US. So Michael, if you can give us your thoughts in up to 5 minutes.
Thank you. Brent, can you hear me? Just making sure you can hear me.
You're good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Juan's presentation focused mostly on the underlying rights and the instruments used to establish those rights, responsibilities, and intents as a way of protecting land and water resources. Those are obviously extremely important because without them, there is little assurance that these areas will be protected at all in the first place. They're also a really good way of documenting the prescriptions and the prohibitions necessary to frame long-term conservation, particularly when dealing with private reserves. I want to build on one of the best practice points that Juan made in his presentation because we often focus disproportionately on the transactions necessary to protect areas, when in reality, we all know that that's just the beginning of the conservation process. At least in the US, the word protection has often been used synonymously with the word conservation. But as Juan pointed out, the real goal is conservation in perpetuity. To achieve that goal requires long-term conservation management. And our real difficult challenge is how to ensure that these areas are cared for long-term. My main point is that this can rarely be accomplished or assured by the initial instruments or the transactions used to protect the area. They are essential, but they're insufficient. So how do we do that? It requires a very different set of mechanisms and processes than those that initially protect those areas. One of these was mentioned by Juan as a best practice, which is the need for broad collaboration, particularly as part of a network of conservation actors. This is the point I want to make most strongly because PPAs are often embedded within a larger conservation landscape of public and private areas. In California, we've had significant success in protecting areas under the initial definition of protection, and the state recently aligned with the goal of IUCN and others of 30% by 2030. We already have a very large number of both public and private protected areas in the state that have been set aside under many different conservation mechanisms, including marine protected areas. But in California, the immediate threats to those places have been replaced by the long-term threat of degradation and lack of stewardship. In fact, long-term stewardship is such a difficult problem that some public agencies have begun refusing to accept additional protected areas because they are unable to sufficiently care for the ones they already have. Private landowners and land trusts, even big established conservation landowners like the Nature Conservancy, have also realized how difficult and costly it is to manage protected areas and have transferred those assets to other owners. Additionally, natural resources, especially ecological processes such as wildfire, flood, invasive species, climate change, even recreational patterns, don't operate or respond to the boundaries defined by property. I would maintain that it is in fact essential that stewardship occur through a larger collaborative network. There are some really good examples of this, and at least in California, this movement is growing very fast. In California, there is an expanding collaboration called the California Landscape Stewardship Network, on whose steering committee that I currently sit, and we are part of the larger national network for landscape conservation. There are other similar initiatives, including the Landscape Conservation Cooperative Network that's led by the US Department of Interior. All of these are focused on bringing together the collaboration at scale that allows management of large conservation landscapes, including privately protected areas. On a smaller scale, network collaboration is also essential for managing protected areas as well, and there are many examples of this. One that I'm familiar with is in the Osa Peninsula of Costa Rica. The Oso Wildlife Refuge is a collaborative of a number of private reserves that both buffer and connect protected areas such as Corcovado National Park. All these networks seek to bring together the diverse people, resources, and institutions necessary to achieve long-term conservation of protected areas. I'll close by stating the obvious, which is that an area is not conserved unless it is protected and stewarded in perpetuity. But solving that problem is at least as much about collaboration and networking at a landscape scale as it is about the mechanisms used to set the land aside. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. One of the nice things about these events is we meet new people. I did not know Michael ahead of this webinar. Next up to respond on PPA subtypes is Kent Redford. Kent is a consultant, a core member of our specialist group, and former staff of the Wildlife Conservation Society. So Kent.
Thank you very much, Brenton. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry that Nigel isn't here to be able to answer some of the detailed questions, but when we get to the question and answer period, we'll try our best. So subtypes of PPAs. Before diving directly into that, I want to give you my own personal history about why we're even needing to have sessions on privately protected areas. The IUCN and the World Conservation Network of Protected Areas historically recognized three major categories of governance: state, national, state, second, indigenous and community, and then finally privately protected areas. And the first decades of its history really were focused on national protected areas. And then through some very well called for lobbying by the global community, there was a shift in focus to indigenous and local peoples in the areas that they can conserve and protect. But there was then very little interest, really, we felt, in shifting towards the third category, which was the privately protected areas. And led by Brent and by Sue Stolten, some of us really pushed into this area and pushed the larger organization to consider this. And then, of course, we're able to network with and include all of you on this call and some of the excellent work that's being done nationally. So we then then the question becomes, okay, now is the same problem recapitulating itself within the privately protected areas? As Nigel points out, and as others have said within these discussions, there often is an eliding of private individuals with privately protected areas. And so much of the conversation and much of the publicity is about that, many of the examples. But as Nigel so correctly points out, there are other categories of actors that are very important for us within the PPA system network framework to be thinking hard about. And so, of course, he ran through these universities, churches, and businesses, and what have you. But thinking about those raises some important questions which aren't necessarily true for other categories, particularly of private individuals. For example, if you think about businesses, this is a category that I think we, within the global examination of this, know little about. We have a suspicion and some really strong examples. For example, the company Cemex in Mexico. So we think that there are some very important areas for biodiversity purposes that are owned and managed by private companies. But there has been little interest in creating bridges between such people and IUCN and the PPA network. And there may be some very good reasons for this, but we don't know very much about what's going on behind the private walls of industry. Nigel gave a couple of examples, there's suggestions, but it's something that we're going to need to work quite hard on reaching out to that community. And if we do, or when we do, we have to respect the fact that there is a truth which many of us find difficult to incorporate, which is that some people, some owners of PPAs don't want to be part of larger systems. And this was raised by James in his presentation. So, we have to be prepared to be told by owners, well, thanks, but we're not interested in working with you. And this is for a variety of reasons. There may be tax reasons. when we did this survey in 2014, we found out that in certain parts of Northern Latin America, owners didn't want to be on any government databases because there were security concerns that they had for having their information publicly available. So we have to try and develop stronger relationships with these sorts of categories, but also understand that there may be good reasons why our efforts would be rebuffed. There also are, in another category of really important and interesting things to think about that may come up if we are able to reach out and form alliances with with businesses that own PPAs. There may be some really interesting situations that are going to be challenging for our traditional ways of thinking. And in particular, there's been reflection on the role of very long linear privately protected areas. So for example, pipelines and power corridors, the companies that manage those frequently have rights to narrow bands on both sides of the infrastructure in order to protect their investment. But it could be that those might be very important connectivity or pollinator or local native plant kind of refuges that could be managed in very, well, with non-traditional approaches. And likewise, drilling platforms out in the ocean have been shown to be attractors of all sorts of marine life. And could it be that those small islands of structure that has been placed on the ocean bottom might be something that's useful? Then finally, there's a question of mixed land use, and Nigel raises this in his presentation, and there was a question regarding his forestry example. So just to sort of respond to that for a moment, the idea isn't that monocultures, forestry monocultures would become privately protected areas. It is that there may be, and have been shown to be, areas within forestry concessions or forest company owned lands which have not been planted in exotic or even monotypical stands, but might serve, but contain native vegetation and might serve as important smaller privately protected areas within a landscape of more forestry oriented land use. And this reflects a pattern that would be found in many other companies, mining, for example. Nigel uses that example, but also in our last session 2 weeks ago, we had a presentation about privately owned tourism concessions that were PPAs, and where there is an interest in, and Nigel mentions this as well, in taking some parts that would have heavier tourism impact, but then having a large part of the rest of the land, which would be managed really primarily for biodiversity concerns. So those are my reflections, and I look forward to a lively set of questions, and will do my best to answer them. Thank you very much, Brent.
Thank you, Kent. Our final sort of prepared comments are on coordination with National Protected Area Systems, and we have Constanza Pinochet. Constanza is the conservation manager at Japangi Foundation in the north of Chile. Constanza, please.
Thank you, Brent. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I would like to share with you more about the case of Chile, where unfortunately the recognition of PPAs in the national system is still pending. But it currently depends on the creation of the new biodiversity service. But this subject has been in discussion in the Congress for more than a decade. So, however, there is a legal figure that allows to declare a protected area on private property, and it functions under private governance called nature sanctuaries. But this category is not very simple to address and is not part of the national system. So the national system and this private recognition involve different state agencies, where coordination efforts are rather specific cases and not part of an integrated policy. So as a way to advance in this recognition and integration of PPAs into the national system of areas, the Association Así Conserva Chile and the Ministry of the Environment are building this year the first official registry of PPAs. And this is according with the new standards for PPAs that have been created. So this will make it possible to know more precisely who and where the PPAs are, and which is an important step towards integrating and recognition into the public management. So in the other hand, another legally binding way to achieve the coordination between the national system and PPAs has been developed recently through the use of the Derecho Real de Conservación. This is a recent legal tool that consists in an agreement which allows a landowner to transfer or to share the conservation responsibility to other entity. So as a great example of this, the PPA Parque Hacienda El Durazno is the first case where CONAF, the public entity in charge of the national system, became the holder of a Derecho Real de Conservación. So this agreement has opened the door for a formal kind of recognition, and also to CONAF to carry out numerous conservation actions inside Hacienda El Durazno Park, and more importantly, also a project to design a biological corridor between these two has been implemented with the World Bank and the GEF funding that will connect this PPA, Parque Hacienda Durazno, with Chinchillas National Reserve, where a highly threatened species live. So finally, although there is still a long way in Chile to go in the recognition of PPAs and their formal incorporation into the national system, novel and effective alternatives have appeared that could be replicated in the short term. So it's interesting that this depends more on the will of institutions and individuals, and not exclusively on a large legislation framework that we don't really know exactly when it's going to be ready or implemented. So I think both lines of work are important to continue exploring. Thank you.
Thank you, Constanza. And yeah, the Derecho Real de Conservación is a really exciting development in Chile. So I'd ask all of our panelists to turn their videos on, and we will respond to some of the questions, or you can pose questions to each other as well. While you're doing that, couple that I can handle pretty quickly, I think.
O puede ser más como
Getting a little feedback there. From Theophile, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. How can we assess the effectiveness of a PPA in a region, for instance, in Central Africa? One of the things we decided early on with the guidance was to not repeat guidance that applies to all protected areas. And management effectiveness is certainly an area like that. So I would refer you to a growing body of literature on management effectiveness. And IUCN did several webinars specifically on PAME, Protected Area Management Effectiveness. And I would ask Ruchir to put the links to those in the chat so that everyone can access those if they want to. We had a number of questions and comments around the whole topic of private conservation that does not fully meet the definition of a protected area, both in terms of commercial forests that may offer some conservation but not fully qualify, but also from Penny the good point that sometimes full protected area status isn't achieved immediately, but there are stepping stones of sort of lower level conservation along the way that can be important and should be recognized. So does anyone want to respond to those points? James, I saw you nodding, so maybe.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. I can certainly respond to that. Penny, it's a great point, and indeed better coordination, I guess, of all private land conservation mechanisms is really the desired thing here as well. It's worth noting that this specialist group is privately protected areas and nature stewardship more broadly. And while the focus has been largely on PPAs to date, there is a broad remit from this group to consider all of those different mechanisms, because you're right, some of those are very much stepping stones. Others are mechanisms in their own right, which won't evolve to PPAs, but are still very valid and very important for protecting biodiversity in the landscape. So you're right, better integration of those in national systems or within sub-jurisdictional arrangements is really important. And we know in many countries at the moment, it's like in Australia, it can be quite ad hoc at certain times as well.
Anyone else have a response to that? Okay. And I would, from my point of view, I would also point out that there's been a good deal of discussion and consideration, especially as the world, or at least the biodiversity conservation community, turns to this whole question of other effective area-based conservation measures. All can be useful in the proper context, but it is important, I think, an important role for IUCN to maintain the definitions so that we don't mush them all together. IUCN has launched a series of shorter guidance called technical notes, and we developed the very first one that is really spells out in a few short pages how to distinguish a private land conservation or a private OECM from a PPA, from a full-blown PPA. So I would refer you to that, and we'll try to find the link to that and share it as well. For Juan, how do federal agencies like INAH, which I believe is the National Institute of Archaeology and History in Mexico, manage for biodiversity? Are these properties registered on the World Database?
Unfortunately, there's not a good linkage between the National Institute of Anthropology and History and the protection of biodiversity agencies. I'm going to start answering the other way around. The sites that are archaeological archaeological properties have, some of them have a very good, a very well protected background or very well maintained surrounding area, but legally only one of them, the Chichen Itza archaeological site, has the mandate to protect the forest around it. On the other side, they are protected areas that have included archaeological sites. Then sort of the division has been made. I manage from here to there, and you manage the place around your archaeological sites. I think one that's, you pointed out exactly to one of the big and important issues. There should be integrated management of both resources. As of now, one of the reasons for this is that both agencies charge for admission. So there's sort of a jealousy kind of thing going on, that I charge you for going into the archaeological site, and I charge you for going into the protected area. This issue should be worked with more intensity and solved, because it's very important to do so for the integrity of both types of resources.
Great. Thank you, Juan. A question from the Association of Private Nature Reserves in Brazil. how could we obtain support for integrating our data bank on protected areas into the World Conservation Database? I'm going to punt this one because that is very much a subject that we'll be taking up in session 3. So I would recommend you tune into that when Heather Bingham, who is the keeper of the keys for that database, will be talking specifically about that. And we also have a paper in Parks that describes alternative ways of getting data on private reserves into the WDPA. So I'll hold for that and put in a plug for our next session on the 30th of June. Let me see. The further from Sybil about ocean conservation and the initiative in the private sector. It's more of a comment than a question, but I wonder if any of our panelists would want to speak to that. Okay, good. I think unless anyone has other questions in the chat or the Q&A, I think we've in one way or another covered most of your questions, which is great. Our presenters must have done a good job. And I would open it up if any of our panelists have questions for each other.
Brent, this is Kent. Mike Wangi has got 2 questions at the end of the Q&A, which I don't think you may have gotten to.
Okay, yes, sorry, thank you, Kent. How can the biodiversity conservation agenda be reconciled on PPAs that are mainly monocrops of trees as proposed in the subtype owned by commercial forest companies?
So I responded to that, but he's got 2 more later on at 10:07 and down below. Well, I'll just say, the interest is whether or not there's specific guidance in, for example, the forestry case, where a PPA within a forestry concession would have, whether there's any guidance on the requirement to have natural vegetation on that. So that's one of his questions. And then he asks, could we point to some of the realized benefits and how these are shared by the landscape network and managers in the US? So I think probably that goes to Michael.
Sure, I can address that. I would say the benefits arrive in 2 major categories. The first is access to resources. When you're participating in a larger network, you have access to institutions and individuals and resources that you don't individually. Even very large agencies such as the US National Park Service are finding that a single institutional model does not provide them with the resources necessary to manage even large protected areas. The second, and I think is really critical for long-term conservation, is the ability to work at scale, which is how most of the ecological processes operate. So just pick one and the benefits accrue. One of my favorite examples is invasive species, which is a huge issue in California. If I've taken care of the invasive species in my protected area and my neighbor has not, I still have an invasive species problem. And so working together is how you realize the benefits across the landscape. I'm just a big proponent of the idea of working in conservation landscapes as opposed to individual properties or protected areas, because in almost every instance, those areas occur within a larger landscape and need to be managed that way. So really, if you have those problems and issues, the only way to address them effectively and realize those benefits long-term is to work collaboratively in a network.
Michael, this is Ken. Can you say something about fire? Because I think you and James would have an
yeah. James and I could probably both say something about fire. We had almost 4 million acres burn in California last year. It was the most devastating fire season we've had forever, and that's the best example of a natural process that operates at a scale that can only be managed across a landscape and collaboratively. Equally important, at least in California, the wildfire issue is something that we like to say it belongs to everyone and belongs to no one, in the sense that there isn't any entity that is singularly responsible for addressing wildfire. And so it by definition requires the kind of collaboration to manage that we're just figuring out how to do.
Yeah, and I'll add, I might just, sorry.
Go, James, please.
I was going to quickly add to that. We did do some interesting research about 10 years ago, actually doing interviews with private conservation landowners in New South Wales and Queensland, looking at the challenges they faced with applying fire on their covenants. So I can certainly send that link around. But yeah, it's certainly challenging, and it's different trying to manage fire at smaller property scales than larger property scales in national parks, for instance, and that cross-tenure collaboration is absolutely critical to get this done efficiently.
Juan?
Yeah, Brent, I would like to make an observation here. We always speak about ownership. We always speak about property rights, but we must remember, especially us who live in countries where there's traditional communities who have a different vision of ownership or use of the land, and that should always be taken care of in the management of privately protected areas. For instance, in our private reserve, there were people coming in to get the water for their everyday use from our property. Of course, we could not close that. We first tried to put access through a private road, put a door there so they would come in, but it was not convenient for them. The women had to walk too long to get salir. They had to work too long to walk too long to go to a place. So we finally agreed to put a door in an adjacent property, and they would come in and out as they pleased. And that was an agreement, not written agreement, with the adjacent community that fit everybody. The women were the ones who came for the water, and they were indigenous women. They did not like to be seen, so they just started going to the waterfall where the well was in the mornings. Then, for instance, everybody came in and cut the branches for trees, so in order to sell them, and we said, okay, we're gonna only be giving it for free to one of you, as long as you cut the trees in such a way that it doesn't cut the branches in such a way that it doesn't hurt the tree. So little by little, you have to work with the communities. You don't come and impose your will just because you have the property. You'll never be able to defend that. You need to work with the communities in order to protect your property.
Thanks, Juan. Perhaps a final point from the audience. Where did I look? Stuart mentions that in European policy, the role of PPAs in achieving 30 by 30 extent and connectivity is yet to be recognized and quantified. I would agree, but I would say it's not limited to Europe. That's something that we're all striving for just about everywhere. But specifically on Europe, I would encourage you again to tune in to the third session where one of our respondents, Tilman Disselhoff, will be from the relatively new European Land Conservation Network, and I'm sure he'll be speaking to that. And do look at the chat. There's some additional information and links and things for people. But as we approach the end of our time, I want to give the floor to Gisela if she has any closing comments, and then I'll take us out at 10:30, or well, not 10:30 for me, half past the hour.
Thank you very much, Brent. Yes, I was wondering, what are the 3 key messages I take from this session? And actually, one of my messages builds very much on what Stuart mentioned in the chat, and that was just read out by Brent, is really the need for a recognition of the role of privately protected areas for the protected area systems, and for achieving, of course, the global biodiversity targets. And I think this has become very evident in this session, and we heard some quite interesting approaches. And yeah, I think one very powerful approach was, just start with mapping, put them on the map together with other types of protected areas. Another message for me really was, the many interesting ways how to encourage other landowners to establish privately protected areas on their land. And I think it was clear that this is very much context specific, and there is no blueprint for that, but we really have to be, I think, very creative, and we really have to work on that to tap this potential better and stronger than we did so far. And finally, I still have the impression from some of the comments in the chat that this distinction between privately protected areas and OECMs is still a bit fuzzy. And I think there is no guidance on that in the BPGs, but there are, of course, I think there are articles, or there is an article has been published on that as well. But I think it seems to crop up that this every here and then, that this distinction is still not so clear, and I think that could deserve a little bit more discussion still. I would like also on the behalf of BFM, I would like to thank all participants for their active discussions and their patience during this session, and all contributors for their really excellent contributions. Thank you very much. And now I would like to hand over back to Brent.
Thank you, Gisela. And we've had a couple of other questions come in, and some of them are getting answered through the chat. If we don't fully respond to all of them and you still have some lingering questions, or some come to you later, don't hesitate to get in touch with me, and we'll respond to those. But I want to respect your time and close on time. So thanks to everyone on the panel and all of you for tuning in. Coming up on 30 June is the last of our 3 sessions in this series, where we will discuss recording of PPAs, as I mentioned before, describe PPA networks, and take a look ahead to PPAs in post-2020 conservation. So, and finally, thanks very much to Ruchir at IUCN for handing all the technology for this. Good day to you all.